All right, so this is just kind of a review of a passion slash talent of mine, which is related to brewing and more specifically brewing beer at home. So without further ado, I'll dig into it. So first off, it helps to kind of just talk a little bit about the basics of fermentation. So we'll start there. So what is fermentation? In a nutshell, fermentation is the magic formula of sugar plus yeast producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, and that's about it. There's a little more nuance to it, as there are with most things. There's actually some other little esters and flavors produced, but in general, it's yeast eating sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. And that's what it pretty much boils down to. On the technical side, at least especially with beer, the main sugar is maltose, which is C12H22O11, and some amount of glucose, which is C6H12O6, and it converts them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So let me also kind of just briefly talk about different sorts of alcoholic drinks before I dig more directly into beer. So there's lots of different alcoholic drinks, and they are all fairly similar in how it happens. Wine, cider, mead, all sort of happen a little bit more organically. Wine, as people probably know, the main sugar that alcohol uh, turns out from based on the yeast is from grapes. There's a little bit of differential between whether the skins are left on or not, creating kind of red wines and white wines. For hard ciders, not surprisingly, that's from apples as the main sugar source because, cider. Mead is another type of drink that isn't widely popular these days. Certainly it used to be in medieval times and other times in the past because it's a drink made pretty much just from honey. And so all of those, wine, cider, and mead, more or less are directly resulting from those source sugars and yeast, more or less fermenting them and little else. Certainly there's a lot of variability to it, but that's the main ingredients and the main focus of all of those. Whiskey and scotch is kind of the next category I listed, which the main source sugar is usually corn. The special thing there is it's kind of brewed in a similar way to beer and other things that are brewed using some heat and so on, because corn, as you may suspect, isn't terribly sweet to begin with. It's more starchy. So there involves a stage where you work to convert that starch into sugars. And then from there, whiskeys, scotch, things like that actually have a lot higher alcohol, but that's due to a follow-on process after brewing, which actually takes the alcohol and through distillation, it concentrates it down after the fermentation. So it bumps up the alcohol more or less by separating out more of the alcohol from the rest of the solution that's obtained to make a higher alcohol drink. Vodka is similar, used to be from potatoes as the main source of starch that would convert to sugar. These days it's fairly more prevalent using various other grains, but again, potatoes are kind of where it originated from, and again, it's higher alcohol because it goes through a distillation process after fermentation. So that kind of takes us down to beer, which is the main subject of what I'm interested in and spend most of my time kind of working on. And for beer, it's fairly unique in that the source sugar it uses is from barley, and so barley is just kind of a wheat-like grain that's used for this process. So let me dig in a little further about what the ingredients are for beer in particular. So mainly there's four ingredients. There can certainly be other ingredients, and certainly these days there's other different adjuncts and things that happen when people are doing kind of fancy foo-foo different other things. But in general, beer and lots of different beer types down through centuries and centuries of time all derive from four ingredients. So those ingredients are water, not too surprisingly, that's kind of the main ingredient. Barley, again, as the grain that's starchy that gets converted into sugar and then produces alcohol. Hops is also fairly unique to beer, and that's actually used as for various things that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then yeast, which, as I've already previously noted, is the magic fungus that converts sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. I will note there's other adjunct and things, and certainly in kind of a lot of commercial brewing, they kind of stretch and go a bit cheap by adding some additional sugars through. In Budweiser's case, they typically add a bunch of rice up to like 30%. And some other ones like Miller and Coors and some different other varietals will throw in a bunch of corn syrup because it's pretty cheap and kind of bump up the alcohol a bit that way without a whole lot of flavor being added. But in general, I'm going to ignore all that nonsense and concentrate on what I consider real beer, which is derived from water, barley, hops, and yeast. So let's just kind of walk through the different ingredients a little bit. The first one being water. It's pretty much self-explanatory. It's water that you know. It's just H2O. The couple things that can happen to it though are typically it's dechlorinated. If you're starting like I do from tap water in whatever city you live in, usually there's chlorine or chloramine added, and so you'll want to kind of do something to get rid of that. Depending on your brewing process, you may wait until the brewing boil step, in which case if you boil it for a while, chlorine actually gets out of the water. For a lot of what I do, which is some additional steps that actually convert starches to sugars, it's good to get the chlorine out ahead of actually getting to the boil step. So typically I, for smaller batches, use a Brita filter, which I have a picture of kind of in the corner here. For larger batches, I've got more of a camping filter that's used to kind of connect more to a hose type arrangement and will kind of filter out chlorine and some other things as well. So that's typically what's done with water. In some cases, especially if you're trying to produce a certain type of beer from a certain region, a certain style, typically those derive from different areas around the world that might have certain mineral compounds or a certain hardness to the water in that particular region that kind of affects a little bit how the beer tastes. So people that are really trying to create clones or really reproduce faithfully some exact type of beer style, sometimes they'll augment the water a bit by adding certain minerals or salts to again achieve the certain hardness or mineral compound that would be similar to what was the native water supply in a particular area. But in general, that's kind of an advanced topic that I don't particularly spend much time on. The next ingredient of the four, like I mentioned, is barley. It's a wheat-like grain. There certainly are some beers that actually use wheat and some other sorts of grains, as I mentioned, but in general, barley is the main ingredient used throughout the beer making world. And in general, it's mostly unique because most other things use other types of grains or other types of compounds, so barley is fairly unique to beer. To really get it to do what you need to do, there's a couple of steps that happen to it. The first step that usually home brewers and even commercial brewers don't bother with. There's companies that do this for a living and everybody pretty much relies on. But the first step is from barley that's been harvested from the field is to malt it, and so that's essentially a process that tries to sprout it a little bit. So it adds some water, lets it sit for a little bit, dries it off, add some more water, lets it sit for a little bit, dries it off. But essentially, after a couple days, since barley is a grain, aka a seed, like most seeds, like your lawn you could think of, after a couple days of a bit of watering, it'll actually start sprouting. So in the case of a lawn or something, other seed that you're really trying to get to grow, then you keep watering it and follow that, and you get roots going down one direction, and you get kind of the plant evolving out of the seed in the other direction. In the case of barley, all we're really trying to do is malt it enough to sort of get it to just begin to germinate and begin to sprout. And what's happening internal to the seeds in those cases are they're actually developing some proteins that are needed. And so in the case of a plant, it's pretty important to turn that seed and the starch inside it into some sugars that can rapidly help a plant expand. So in our case, we're malting it to get those proteins going, get the seed ready to start converting from starch to sugars because, as previously mentioned, we want yeast to chew on the sugars. It can't do a whole lot with starches, so that's the first step, is to get things converted over to sugars. So that's, in a nutshell, the malting process of barley. The next step that happens is typically it's roasted. And so again, this is something that typically isn't done at home. This is something that when you go to the store, you buy things online, it's already been roasted for you. So the vast majority of the barley that's used in beer making isn't roasted. It's just kind of normal, fairly fresh, not altered 2-row or 6-row barley, but various types of roasting from light to kind of dark roasting are important for different styles of beer, especially things like porters and stouts, where they tend to be darker beers. There's actually not a huge amount. It's a relatively small portion of the barley that is actually roasted, but adding a bit of roasted barley into some beers will entirely change the beer flavor in the final product, like I mentioned, porters and stouts, for example. So it's a fairly simple process, but again, that's all stuff that happens kind of upstream, typically of commercial and home brewers getting hold of the barley. It's already been roasted to certain levels, and you can purchase different types of barley that's been roasted to different levels and combine them into a recipe. And then the last thing that sort of happens before you actually get brewing is you need to kind of crack open the grain. So what we're shooting for here isn't really what you would do typically with wheat or something that you're turning into breads where you grind it to a fine powder that's a flour, because what we don't want to have happen is when we add water to the barley, we don't really want a gluey, sticky uh, substance that ends up having water not being able to flow through it, which would be a problem for what we want to do. So in general, what happens is you just sort of crack open the barley by running it through some rollers that are slightly smaller than the actual seeds are, and it just kind of cracks them open without a whole lot of powder being generated. And again, that we'll look at that a little bit further. Um, from a home brewing format and typical brewing format, there's a couple different ways that barley shows up. Again, you can typically go to a homebrew store or buy online whole grains, and then you have to crack it yourself, or in the case of a homebrew store, you can kind of take some different whole grains, measure them out, put them together to form a recipe, and then usually in stores they'll have a grain mill that you can run them through to kind of crack all the grains open, and then you've got some nice fresh grain to take home and start brewing with. Alternatively, you can actually buy pre-cracked grains, especially if you're buying online. You can get things already cracked, but in those cases, then they need to kind of package them in plastic or some sort of sealed container so that they stay nice and fresh, and you can work with them when you get home. But it ends up generating a lot more plastic waste in particular, which is something I tend to favor. And then finally, the third kind of category, and something that makes it easier for people to get started with brewing at home, is extracts and kind of powdered barley. And for those, all the work involved in taking grains and steeping them at certain temperatures and doing things to kind of extract and convert the starches to sugars that the yeast can jump on is already done for you. And so somebody else does all that in a commercial facility and then condenses it down so that what you end up with is sort of a sugary syrup, or in some cases, if they take out all the water, you end up actually with a powder. And then you simply kind of add some water back to it, mix it up, and you end up back with what you otherwise would have had to have done a bunch of work to get to from starting from grains. The
So
so
this is the grain. It's barley, and it's a little hard to see, but you can sort of see shells and husks as well as the actual insides. So again, this is not, the purpose is not to turn it into a flour that would kind of get all sticky and not really allow water to run through it correctly, but instead to sort of crack all the kernels and let it all sort of be in here. There's also, you notice to the side, there's also some darker. And again, this has just been roasted longer, just like they would for coffee sorts of things, to bring out different flavors and a darker sort of roastier sort of flavor to it. So I've got a little bit of that, but the majority of it is just normal two-row barley.
all right, so moving on to the next category of ingredients, which is hops, which is kind of our third ingredient here after water and barley. And hops essentially is a fragrant, uh, can be bitter flowering vine. So essentially it's a vine that has kind of cone-shaped flowers on it, and it's used in brewing, mostly for beer. Again, it's like barley. It's fairly specific to beer brewing in specific. It's not used in a whole lot of other things. And hops is really important for beer, unlike winemaking, where again it's mostly just the grapes and some yeast and some variety of different grapes and yeasts come together to make wine, and the same thing for ciders and meads. In the case of beer, there's, like I said, there's different types of barley. There's different roasting that can happen to it to make a recipe, and then for hops, there's also a bunch of different hop varieties that exist, and beyond that, it's used for several different things, and depending on how you actually process it, you can get different sort of things out of it. And so there's five main areas that hops are used for. It provides bitterness, so that's important because depending on how sweet or not the actual initial starch to sugar that you make is, if you end up with something that ends up being a bit sweet, then you need some amount of bitterness to sort of offset that to make it palatable, make it sort of a neutral flavor. And so that comes from the hops by when you actually take it to the point where you boil everything together. Then if you boil it for a decent length of time, hops will actually have there's little lupulin glands in it, and those will sort of burst open and actually add a bunch of bitterness to the actual end product. So typically, some amount of hops are added early on, and we'll talk more about process, but uh, the hops are used initially for boiling for a long bit of time to add some bitterness to the overall beer. The second thing that it can add is flavoring. If you boil for a long time, the flavoring kind of all disappears, like with a lot of things. So for flavoring, typically you add some additional hops just a short time before the end of the boil, so in 3 to 5 minute range. And again, we'll talk about it more when we talk about process. But again, at the fairly near the end of the boil, you add some flavoring, and it has enough time to cook in there and boil a bit to get some of the flavor out, but not so long that the oils and esters kind of all boil off. And then finally, third of four is aroma. So there is a floral fragrance to hops that's fairly unique. And so if you add it just after the boil, or sometimes it's added while the boil is cooling down, and in other cases even added sometimes additionally even after before or after fermentation happens, some additional hops is added, and mostly the purpose of all that is to add a little bit of aroma, well, actually a lot of aroma and a little bit of flavoring. And then the fourth kind of category of what hops gives you is preservative. So there's antibiotic properties that are part of hops in particular, so it has those sort of properties to it. So when you boil hops, it releases, as part of the bittering process, it actually releases some compounds that will act as antibiotics, and that's helpful because it'll help the shelf life. In particular, things like it's gotten pretty popular in the last decade or two. India Pale Ales, in particular, those were initially created with a lot of hops in them, and the purpose was to be able to survive on ships for the long voyage from England to India. And so India Pale Ales tend to have lots of hops in them because they've got good antibiotic properties, and they keep bacterias and things from infecting the beer on kind of what used to be long voyages. Um, and in general, again, it's not a cure-all, but it helps with shelf life, and it also helps during fermentation to keep some amount of bacteria in check by being an antibiotic. From a brewing format perspective, usually for home brewing, these show up as sort of they've already been sort of pulverized and processed and compressed into little pellets that look a lot like little things you'd feed a hamster or a gerbil or something, but they're compressed. But again, when you add them to water, they expand back and act pretty much the same as if you just started with kind of the whole hops flowers, but they're in a lot better kind of format to package and deal with.
This is typically what hops comes in for homebrewing, at least. It's reasonably small packet sizes, and like I mentioned, it's all been pelletized here. So what you end up with is some very small pellets that, when added to water, kind of expand greatly and turn back into sort of pulverized hops. You can sort of see some of the powder here. But instead, this amount would probably be equal to several large handfuls of the original hops flour.
All right, then moving on to the fourth ingredient is yeast, and I term this a most magical fungus. Yeast is it's a fungus. It's a single-celled microorganism, and when I was doing a little research on it, just curious about how many different types there were. Somebody listed that there's at least 1,500 different species that are recognized. So there's a lot of variety to yeast. Certainly, some are better for certain things and not so good for other things. So there's certainly yeasts that typically get used in bread making. And other sort of things like wine yeast are a bit different than other things. Yeast that you use in bread are a little bit different. In particular, the main couple of categories that we use for beer making are in the categories of ale yeast or lager yeast. So in general, again, yeast eats sugars. It reproduces rapidly using some amount of oxygen that's hopefully present. And then it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. So ale yeast tends to ferment pretty quickly. It ferments near the top of whatever you have going on, and it tends to be happiest around 20 degrees Celsius, so fairly room temperature-y, at least, kind of in spring and fall sort of temperatures. The other main category of yeast are called lager yeast, and these ferment typically a lot slower. When they're done, the yeast kind of falls to the bottom, so they're called bottom fermenting, even though they don't necessarily ferment at the bottom, but at least when fermentation completes, the yeast tends to fall into solution pretty easily to the bottom. And these tend to be liking things a bit colder, so lagers tend to get fermented at more around 10 degrees Celsius. From a brewing format perspective, typically they are available just like bread yeast that you might be familiar with in a dry format or also in liquid packaging. And the picture I have here, this is a fairly typical premium yeast, but it's actually a dry yeast that you would actually sprinkle on at a certain point during the process. There's other yeasts that are liquid yeast that you prepare a little bit differently, but in general, they're already in a kind of liquid form and typically have a lot more yeast already packaged as part of the product, and not surprisingly are more expensive. So let's talk a little bit about the process. So the process of brewing kind of mostly falls into three main steps. The first one is what's called wort production, and again, this is sort of creating the beer base. It's getting a sugary, watery, hoppy solution that's all ready for fermentation. The second step is actually the fermentation, where you then add the yeast in, and the yeast does its thing. So you more or less add the yeast in, and you wait a while, and yeast does what it does, and it takes the sugars that are there and converts them into alcohol and carbon dioxide and some other flavors and things depending on the variety, and you just sit back and wait for that to happen. And then the final step of brewing typically is beer typically is a carbonated beverage, so there's a carbonation and kind of a packaging step. And so depending on whether you're bottling it or kegging it or what you're actually doing with the beer, the steps can end up in slightly different orders. But in general, you're going to carbonate it by letting the CO2 kind of stay in the solution, and you're going to package it in some form, in bottles or cans or kegs. So let's kind of run through each of these steps separately. Again, the first one, like I mentioned, was wort production, which is sort of making a beer base, if you will. So to produce the wort, in general, this is, and again, these are the first of the three steps, but this step is typically the most effort intensive. I've called it moderate to high level of effort, and it's measured kind of in hours of effort. So depending on what sort of heating or cooling methods you're using and the size of the batch, this can be anywhere from a couple hours to kind of what people call a brew day. It takes 8, 10, 12 hours to kind of get through the whole process. The first step again is kind of extracting sugars. As I mentioned, barley's a grain, and so it's a starchy something, but that's not what yeast can really deal with. They really need something already converted to sugar. So the first step is kind of extracting sugars from that starchy barley, otherwise known as starch conversion or saccharification. So essentially barley and water are steeped together and held at some very specific temperatures where different things happen. So the first one, which is used for some brewing, it's not used a whole lot these days because during that malting process, companies and technologies gotten pretty sophisticated. So most barley these days actually has a fair amount of protein already activated in it, like I mentioned during the malting process. So for an awful lot of beer brewing, you don't really need to do this first stage, but for some types, you still have to sort of do a protein rest. And essentially what that does is if you hold it at about 50 degrees Celsius for an hour or so, some of the inherent proteins that exist in the barley will get activated and kind of be ready to help convert the starches to sugars by doing that. The next couple steps, the beta amylase stage and alpha amylase temperatures, depending on, again, what kind of beer you're trying to produce, how sweet or dry you're trying to make it, you kind of hold it at a couple different temperatures. So if you're trying to produce a fairly dry wort, meaning that the sugars that get produced, the yeast is going to entirely use up and not have a whole lot of residual sweetness when you're all done, then you tend to be trying to produce beta amylase, and you hold closer to 62 degrees Celsius. And again, there's some variability in that, but that's kind of a general target. Instead, or in addition to that, maybe in combination with some amount of dryness, you want some amount of sweetness as well. That's achieved by activating some amount of alpha amylase saccharification. So if you do that, then some amount of the sugar that's produced is in a form that the yeast can't eat or digest, or however you want to think of it. And so essentially, if you hold it at closer to 70 degrees Celsius, you'll end up with a wort that after the yeast is done converting sugars to alcohol, there's some amount of sugar that it doesn't know what to do with, and it remains. And therefore, what you end up with from a wort perspective and a beer perspective is a little bit sweeter. So again, depending on the beer style you're trying to do, you may do a rest at both of these temperatures, or just one or the other, or somewhere in between, depending on how sweet or dry you're trying to shoot for. And then the final step, kind of as you're extracting sugars, is what's called mash out. And again, here too, this isn't as widely used these days, but in general, if you pretty quickly raise the temperature up to around 77 degrees Celsius, then that's a temperature that kind of stops proteins from doing any more work, and no more conversion happens at that point. So that kind of helps the proteins sort of stop doing what they're doing and fall into solution a bit. So again, to do this, it's not terribly hard, but it's a bit time consuming. It's a little fiddly with temperatures and things to make this all happen. So again, alternatively, and especially with people who start out home brewing, they tend to skip all this and instead use an alternate step, which again is you start with a malt extract or a powder. And by doing that, you skip doing all this work of extracting the sugars, and you get a product that already has barley sugar in either an extract or powder form, and you simply mix it with water and then move on to the boil step. So again, that's step one, is again getting sugars out of the barley. Step two to make a wort is again introducing the hops and all those hops things I was previously talking about. It. So the the first one, like I mentioned, is you kind of get the wort up to a boil, and again that does a couple things. One, it helps sterilize everything, which is an important part of brewing, because you don't really want additional yeast from the air or bacteria or anything else that might be around trying to do anything with the sugars that you're producing. So getting it up to a boil kind of kills everything off, which is great. But again, you then throw in some of the hops that is used for bittering, and usually over the course of about an hour, that will boil and produce and will kind of extract all the bitterness out of hops that's there to be extracted. Again, like I mentioned previously, near the end of the boil, you will throw in a little bit more hops to add a little bit of hops flavor. Sometimes it's the same variety, sometimes it's a different one. So again, there's some hops varieties that are kind of, known for certain types of bitterness. There's other ones that are known for certain types of flavoring. And finally, there's other ones that are known for certain types of aroma. So depending on what kind of beer you're making, and again, it may be the same type of hops that you use for all three of these steps. It may be entirely different hops you use for all three of these steps. So there's just a lot of variability. Even though these are all the same ingredients, you can get an awful lot of different beers, pretty much all the different beers on the market, by just varying the yeast used, which type of hops you use, and at which points you add them, and then again, how you extract the sugars and what sorts of barleys you use. So even from just simply 4 ingredients, there's an incredible amount of variety of beers that come out. And again, just to touch on the aroma part, that's kind of usually added just after the boil, because if it's boiled at all, the the oils and essential oils that produced some aroma all kind of disappear. So they're pretty fragile. So you kind of add them when the temperature is fairly high post boil, or even when it's cooling off, or in some cases, you add it after it's all cooled off, or even after the fermentation for longer periods of time to add some aroma to it. And then again, after you've got the sugars out, you've gotten to a boil and done all the hops things to add bitterness and flavor and aroma, the last step of making the wort is to get it cooled down. And again, you want to kind of do this pretty rapidly, like most things that you heat up and need to preserve and try to keep bacteria out of. You want to get it cooled down in a hurry so that bacteria doesn't have as much of a chance to form sort of in the medium temperatures that bacteria likes. So the actual target temperature is dependent on the actual yeast strain. Typically, it's 70 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's again, that's more in the 20 to 25 degrees Celsius sort of territory is what a lot of yeasts like, at least especially ale yeasts, lager yeast, a little bit cooler than that. So the next step after you've kind of got all the sugars out and you've made your wort is to ferment it. And so again, this is where yeast does its thing. I've got a few steps here, but in general, there's really not a whole lot to do. This is measured in days or weeks worth of time, depending on the yeast strain and the beer style and fermentation temperature and lots of different things. The effort here is pretty little. I mean, essentially, once you've created the wort, you've got sugary water with the hops in there and the quantities and the types that you want. More or less, you take the cooled off wort and you throw the yeast into it and you let the yeast do its thing. So the first step is to, like I mentioned here in step one, is you add the yeast, which is called pitching the yeast, and you do that into the cooled wort. Step two to it is you kind of then seal it up. And so again, this may be in sort of a bucket. It could be in what's glass of some type. There's things called glass carboys that are kind of made to do this. There's lots of different varieties of things, but in general for home brewing, it's usually kind of a bigger bucket or carboy that's usually in the 7-gallon, roughly 30 liter sort of size. And then you seal it up. And when I say seal it up, it's like, well, it's sort of true. It's not entirely sealed because, as I mentioned, it's producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, and it's actually going to produce a lot of carbon dioxide. So if you seal it up, you're going to essentially let the pressure raise and raise and raise until either whatever you're trying to seal up blows up, or more likely the pressure gets to such a high point that the yeast stops doing what it does and doesn't really finish doing the fermentation. So in general, you don't want any of that. You want the CO2 that develops the carbon dioxide to just sort of bubble off and get out of the product as it's working along, because mostly at this step you're interested in the sugars turning into alcohol and you don't really care so much about the carbon dioxide part. And so in general, this is achieved by just having some sort of mechanism where the CO2 can bubble out, but bad things can't get back in. So typically you either kind of, run a hose into what you're fermenting and stick that down in the bottom of a little small glass or pail of water and let the carbon dioxide bubble out, but it doesn't really give a way for bacteria to easily get back upstream into it. There's simplified versions of that called airlocks that essentially you can put a little bit of water in and lets the carbon dioxide bubble out and doesn't really let bacteria get back in. The third step, again, after you've just thrown the yeast in and you've sealed it up, which takes little to no time at all, is to just literally wait for days or weeks, depending on again the yeast and the beer style and so on. So you just let the yeast do its thing. It does all the work for you. It converts all the sugars it can to alcohol and everything that it's going to do. And then finally, sometimes there's a step 4. People have different debates about this, but fairly typical in homebrewing at least is people will, after about a week or 5 days to a week, there's an awful lot of things that kind of fall out of solution in the first week. A lot of fermentation happens and a lot of kind of junk falls to the bottom called trub. And in general, a lot of people think that, well, if you just kind of leave it in that state for a long time, then all that junk that sort of fell out of solution will actually add some weird off flavors and things. So fairly typical. People will, after about 5 days to a week, they'll take the wort or beer, I guess at this point, and siphon it off, move it off to a second fermentation vessel, another glass carboy or another pail or something, to get it off all that junk, and then let it sit for another week or two to kind of finish up any fermentation it's going to do and sit and rest for a little bit. So essentially, that's the fermentation process. So again, not a whole lot of work involved. Mostly after kind of making the wort, you just sit back and let the yeast thing. And then the final third step of the overall process is once you're done doing all that, then you typically want to package it and get it carbonated. Because again, beer typically is a carbonated, fizzy sort of drink. So um, to do that, typically you end up putting in some sort of package. You let a little bit more fermentation happen that produces a little bit more carbon dioxide, and that'll actually kind of then carbonate it all by itself without having to do special things. So this stuff, I sort of say it's measured more in hours of hands-on or and kind of days waiting with kind of a moderate level of effort. It can be a little bit time intensive if you're having to clean and sanitize a whole bunch of bottles that you're going to put stuff into. So again, depending on the yeast strain, the beer style, the fermentation temperature, it can take different amounts of time to kind of deal with this step. The typical steps, again, that I've got listed here are for kind of basic bottling. And so the steps are pretty simple. Since the yeast has already eaten up all the sugar that it could pretty much during the fermentation step that you've done, that's great. You've got the alcohol kind of produced out of it, and it's mostly beer at this point. But since you want to have it actually carbonate in a bottle, then typically you add a little bit more sugar. You very carefully calculate this part because if you don't have enough sugar in it, then you're not going to get the carbonation you want, and it's going to be kind of like not very fizzy. If you, on the other hand, you overcook it, you get a little bit too much sugar in there, and then you put things in bottles and you put nice caps on them. If you're lucky, then the cap will start leaking. If you're unlucky, then bottles will start exploding. So that's not something that anybody wants. So this is a part where you really kind of need to make sure that the general fermentation is done, and you add a very carefully calculated amount of sugar that will add the right amount of carbonation, but not so much that, again, you're exploding glass bottles in particular. So again, you add that sugar, you package it up, again, usually either into washed and sanitized bottles, or that you kind of fill and then you install a cap on them, or alternately, things that I use a lot are kind of 5-liter mini kegs. I can take a typical big batch of beer, which is about 5 gallons of beer, or about 20 liters, and I can put it into 4 kind of dab-sized mini kegs that are 5 liters each. So it's not as much work to kind of wash and sanitize 4 little mini kegs that fit nicely in the fridge, and then I can deal with them that way. Or alternately, you can even use what historically were Coke or Pepsi shipped their syrup in kegs, in kind of syrup kegs that water was run into in certain quantities and the carbonation was added on the fly to make, Coke or Pepsi. But essentially, there's a lot of kind of historically a lot of about 5-gallon or 20-liter soda kegs that exist that are great because you can take a normal 5-gallon batch of beer, put it into a single soda-sized keg, and deal with it that way. So that's also an option. Of course, if you do that, then you have to have some way to put a fairly large something in and get it cold so it doesn't fit in a typical fridge. You also need some way to carbonate it. You also need some way to kind of dispense it. So there's additional things that need to happen if you go that route versus just simply doing it in bottles. The third step here, again, like I mentioned, is carbonating. So once you've added some sugar and you have it in some sort of package, then it needs to carbonate. And again, just like fermentation, yeast is doing a mini fermentation here. So there's really nothing you need to do. You sit back and you let a little mini cycle of fermentation happen in each bottle. If you're doing a bottle or a keg, if you put it in a keg, not really much. It's a very small amount of sugar, and therefore it's a very small amount of additional alcohol that happens. It really is negligible. But again, since CO2 is so voluminous during the normal fermentation process, it doesn't really take a whole lot of additional sugar to really kind of add a decent amount of CO2. So once you've got got the beer in a package and it's fully sealed, there's nowhere for the carbon dioxide to go other than to end up working itself into solution, and therefore you end up with carbonated beer. And again, this is sort of measured typically in several days to weeks worth of time, so it doesn't take a whole lot of time for this to happen. And then again, there's a little bit of junk that falls out of solution. The yeast gets done, and a little bit of junk falls out, but to the bottom of the bottle. So again, with homebrew beer, typically you're careful when you pour it. You can kind of pour most of the beer. You leave the last little bit typically in the bottom because it's just a little bit of leftover junk. And then finally, after you've done all that and you've let it sit and carbonate for a week at temperatures that the yeast wants to live at, then you can do the final step, which is cooling it down. Let it sit overnight in a beer, in a refrigerator or something, and then you can crack one open and you've got a fresh beer to drink. Sometimes, depending again on the beer style, it may be great the first day or two. In some cases, you might want to wait a few days because the beer is still going to mature a little bit more. But in general, it doesn't take very long until you can start drinking it. I won't get into too much into the details, but the alternative here is kind of what they do for commercial kegging or bottling, which is they actually kind of have all these steps in kind of the exact opposite order. So instead of adding some carbonating sugar and then packaging it, letting carbonation happen, and then cooling it, instead they kind of go backwards. They start with some sort of mechanism they have to cool the beer off, otherwise known as kind of cold crashing, but they'll use some sort of glycol base or refrigeration to rapidly cool the beer down to near freezing. That does two things. One, it helps kind of force any additional sediment out of solution. So again, it gets kind of some junk to fall out of the beer, so it ends up being a lot clearer. The other thing it typically does is it once it's nice and cold, it's much easier to carbonate. So you really can't easily carbonate warm beer. You really need to get it cool typically if you're gonna kind of force carbon dioxide into it. So getting it nice and cold allows for kind of forced carbonation. And that's what they do in the second step. They essentially take pure carbon dioxide gas and they kind of attach it into the tanks and they force carbon dioxide into the beer, and it doesn't take too long depending on the mechanism they use, but essentially they take it and they force the CO2 into solution, and then it's carbonated. So again, rather than doing another fermentation cycle, they cheat and shortcut that by just shoving CO2 gas in and carbonating it like they would a soda or something else. And then the last step is to package it. So again, after they've cooled it and carbonated it, then that's the point at which then they put it into kegs or bottles or cans. And again, they use they use slightly different processes here as well, but typically they'll kind of pressurize a keg so that it's the same pressure as the beer is, and then they can just kind of pour the beer into the keg without it fizzing up or doing anything weird because the pressures are equal. And the same thing sort of thing for bottles and cans. So finally, I'll do a couple of quick things here. I've got a quick little 5-minute tour of kind of some of the equipment I have and typically the sort of stuff that I use. So I've just kind of shot a quick little video of some of my equipment and talk a little bit about what I use. Finally, I'll just give a brief tour of some of the miscellaneous brewing equipment I use most often. I'm here in my garage, which is also my brew center. Kayaks and bikes and whatnot in here. It's kind of everything's kind of crammed in here, but I've taken over the space by the sink, which is pretty essential when you're brewing because you need to wash and sanitize a lot of things at different steps. But in general, what I use a lot is this unit here, which looks like a big coffee maker, and essentially that's what it is. But it'll pull about 15 amps of 110 current, so it's good for, and it has a timer on it, so I can set it to get water up to a certain temperature, and then when I'm available, then I can start my brewing process with the beer already kind of up at the temperature I need it to be to put grains in and get going. So essentially that's what it does. It's for brewing kind of full-size batches. So put about 7-8 gallons of water in here. There's a insert inside it that is later used to pull the grains out after they've steeped and gotten the sugars out, so that can get pulled out and drained back into the main recipe units. When it's all done boiling and done doing what I'm doing, then I use this thing here, which is an immersion chiller, and essentially it's pretty simple. It's just a whole bunch of copper tubing with a couple hose fittings on it, and various hoses I have that I've set connectors into. So essentially I can run water from the tap through it and back out, and so essentially the whole thing dips down inside the brewing vessel. You run kind of cold water from the tap through it, and that kind of cools it down to near tap temperature fairly quickly. And then there's obviously a way to get the wort out when you're all done via various tubing into where you're going to collect it into and do fermentation. So that's what I use a lot of the time these days for bigger batches. I guess while I'm here, there's, in addition to the bottles that I showed earlier, there's these 5-liter mini kegs, and I've got a set of these, which really make it easy because I can put a whole batch of beer into 4 of those mini kegs, seal them up and carbonate them, and they're a good size for the fridge. Kind of back around through here, we've got our old house refrigerator I need to replace the compressor in, and get that sprung back to life for helping me brew when it's in the middle of summer. But I've got some amount of, again, extra kegs and bottles and things I use depending on what I'm making or what I'm bottling. So I've got some of that stuff back here. Kind of back around this way, I've got a old freezer unit. Again, this has no compressor. It doesn't cool at all. It's just essentially a big insulated box. But I found it and rescued it before somebody was sending it to a dump from a restaurant, and so I kind of use it for, at least in the winter, because I can heat it with a small little heating pad and keep it at a decent temperature for brewing, and so it lets me kind of brew through the winter at different temperatures. But we got some amount of equipment stacked up here. I got some cider in a small little vessel up top here. This is an airlock that I talked about a bit earlier, but essentially it lets the CO2 kind of bubble out through some water that's in there, and essentially it keeps air from kind of getting right back in because it has to get through a water supply. Just miscellaneous different things, additives, a bunch of cleaning and sanitization stuff here. My daughter's little drawing on the cleaning solution, so that people realize that even though it's in a little jug, that it's kind of a cleaning solution that shouldn't be drunk. Then I've also got some sanitizer, and then over here it's where I mainly use, because I can fit 4 different fermentation things in here. So again, at the moment I've got another thing of cider going. I've also got some beer that's mostly finished up here in a big glass carboy. It's about 7 gallons, and a couple more in the back that I don't have anything in right at the moment, that are just kind of waiting for the next batch. So there's all that. And then in general, since I've been doing this for about 30 years, I've accumulated different ways to do different things. So kind of back in here, there's here's a bigger style, kind of maybe a little bit hard to see, but a soda style keg, and this is, so I said that's about 20 liters, so about 5 gallons. So this is a good size. It can still fit in some fridges, and lets you kind of force carbonate it and do those sort of things. So you can do an entire batch into just one of these if you have a means to keep this cold and serve from. So that's convenient in some cases. But then again, just different pails and spoons and ways to move things around and stuff that kind of accumulate over time. So that's kind of a quick tour of some of the different pieces of equipment that I use a lot. All right, and then finally, I'll just hit the quick category, which is once you get brewing and brewing beer, then it's sort of a gateway drug into lots of other things. Once you're busy making beer, then of course you have to have some pizza going with it. So I've kind of definitely gotten into a lot of pizza making, got some pizza stones, and I do some amount of grilling outside as well. So typically, just about every Friday, I'm making some pizzas for the family for dinner. Lots of different ways. In general, again, here's a picture of doing it to the oven on some pizza stones to help kind of the bottom crisp up a bit, or doing it in a pan for my native city of Detroit, sort of Detroit style pizza. Um, I also have the shot of a couple of kids eating some pizza. um, the surly teens, but again, that's kind of a typical Friday in our household is making some pizza and having it for dinner.
Here's
Um,
a kind of instead of having bottles that are cappable, I tend to use some of these larger bottles that have kind of a German style Grolsch swing top cap that I can cap this way after sterilizing. So they come in pretty handy for bottling. In this particular case, I've actually cracked open a mead that I made about 3 years ago. It's fairly dark, and that's because it was actually made from honey that bees who were pollinating a avocado crop made their honey from. So the honey itself was dark and kind of interesting flavor to begin with, and it's really made some very interesting mead.
all right, and then of course once you have all those things, then you also you're busy brewing beer, and you especially at my age, you need some friends to help drink it for you because it's way too much beer to drink all by yourself. So that kind of leads to things like building a fire pit. So again, definitely have done that over the past summer. Kind of dug down and built myself a fire pit that then got required a bunch of wood and so on. But that's been pretty handy for kind of having some nice have some friends over even during the COVID era. If you talk over a well roasting campfire, the theory at least I have is that the COVID can't get through such flames, and it's kind of a safe environment to sit out and hang out with people in. It also kind of leads, unfortunately, to buying more and more equipment that help you out different ways. So again, like I said, I've got various different sort of mini kegs that are kind of convenient to brew into, but then you need to have ways to carbonate it and so on. So I've got like little mini taps and way to carbonate things and so on. And the right picture just kind of shows a more recent purchase I have. I've got several 1 gallon or 4 liter sized kind of double insulated little mini kegs that I can force carbonate, and then actually with a small little kind of BB gun sized CO2 cartridge, they'll actually kind of auto dispense, so they kind of come in nice and handy. I can fit 4 of them in a little mini fridge, and then foist them on people at parties or fire pits or things by traveling them around. And then finally, with all this sort of stuff, it's like, hey, you've got beer going on and friends over and so on, then it kind of leads to, of course, needing more and more grilling options. So again, it just it tends to spiral out in lots of different directions and cost you lots of money and getting you involved in other things. But it's all been a nice journey. And then finally, I'll add that also because it kind of produces grains that I don't really know what to do with and kind of hate throwing things out and always looking for ways to recycle or so on. I've gotten a bit into vermicomposting, which is worms. So essentially, I've got for the winter, I've got sort of an indoor setup of multiple tiers of things, but essentially, worms love eating the leftover grain from producing beer. So once I kind of take a bunch of grain and do the whole wort making process of mashing it out and getting the sugars out of it, I'll take the grains and dump them into a container and the worms will move into it, and so between that and some recycled bills and documents, plus some amount of cardboard that comes into the house, and brown paper bags and things like that, you can kind of rip all that up, mix it together, and the worms kind of love it. So that's what I've been doing with a lot of the other ingredients, so that I'm not really kind of wasting all that.
Welcome to the McComfort Worm Farm. All right, let's take a look at these beauties.
Wait, I got another one to add.
Welcome to the McComfort Worm.
All right. So in summary, again, I'll just kind of quickly run through it. But again, overall homebrewing beer is just, essentially it's yeast and sugar producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. Initially, you let all that carbon dioxide go, and later you package it up and seal it up so that that carbon dioxide can kind of carbonate the beer. So again, typically water's heated to about 70 degrees ish. You get the barley that's already been malted and cracked added in. You wait an hour while it kind of does its conversion to kind of get a lot of that starch converted to sugar. You then, well, I missed a step here of ideally getting that grain back out of things. You then take what's left, the watery, sugary solution called wort, and you get that to a boil. You add several stages of hops depending on how much bittering or flavor and aromas you're looking for, depending on the beer style. You cool it all off to more or less room temperature for most beer types, a bit cooler for lager types. You pitch the yeast by essentially throwing it in, and you seal it up with an airlock so that the yeast can multiply, chomp on the sugars, produce the alcohol, and let the carbon dioxide bubble out without getting bacteria or other wild yeast into it. You wait a week or two, depending on what you're doing. You mix a little bit of sugar into it and throw it into a bottle or keg and seal it up, and then wait several days while it carbonates, cool it all down, and then you're ready to go. So again, it's a bit of work and or simple depending on which steps you do and which procedures you have and what equipment you have. But again, it's a kind of enjoyable way to spend a day or two, and just like bread making or baking or lots of other things, it's fun to sort of see an end product that you've created from scratch, or more or less from scratch, being produced. So there it is, in a little bit over an hour that I was shooting for 20 minutes, but nonetheless, that's my intro to homebrewing.